The night Jimmy Burke first tasted power, the air in Queens was thick with cigarette smoke, whiskey breath, and the promise of fast money. The city was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of 1,000 hustles. Trains clattered over rusted tracks, cars honked, bars buzzed, and somewhere in that chaos, a tall, sharp-eyed Irishman learned that loyalty could be bought, and silence could be priceless. Jimmy wasn't born into the mob. He was born into the streets. An orphan shuttled between foster homes. He learned early that the world didn't hand out favors. It demanded you take what you wanted. He started with petty jobs, running packages, boosting cars, fencing stolen goods. But what set Jimmy apart wasn't just his nerve, it was his calm. Where others panicked, he planned. Where others got caught, Jimmy slipped away with a smile and a stack of cash. By the 1950s, Jimmy had built a reputation that stretched from Brooklyn to the Bronx. He was young, but he had that rare mix of charm and danger that made men trust him and fear him in the same breath. He wore clean suits, kept his hair slicked back, and carried himself like someone who already knew he'd win. The real turning point came when he met Paul Vario, a powerful Lucchese family capo. Vario ran everything from hijackings to unions out of JFK Airport. He saw something in Jimmy, a kind of wild intelligence that couldn't be taught. Paul brought him in unofficially since Irishmen couldn't be made, but inside the circles that mattered, Jimmy Burke was treated like a made man. He started organizing airport heists, using charm to recruit drivers, loaders, and clerks. The men who worked for him called him Jimmy the Gent, because he always took care of them. If someone went down, Jimmy made sure their family was looked after. If someone did good work, Jimmy slipped them a thick envelope. It wasn't just about the money. It was about respect. But respect came with rules. One afternoon in a smoky bar off Rockaway Boulevard, Jimmy leaned in toward his crew and said something that would define his legend. Never rat, never run your mouth. You talk, you die broke. You stay quiet, you die rich. Everyone laughed, thinking it was one of Jimmy's wisecracks. But he wasn't joking. That line would follow him his whole life. The 1960s rolled in, and Jimmy's operations expanded. He wasn't just hijacking trucks anymore. He was manipulating unions, fixing horse races, and smoothing out real estate deals for the mob. But he kept his hands clean. On paper, he was just a hard-working businessman. Still, those who knew the real Jimmy could feel the edge beneath his calm. He had a way of looking at you, steady and cold, that made even seasoned wise guys rethink their words. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. He didn't need to. People just knew. By then, Jimmy had surrounded himself with a crew that would one day make history. There was Tommy DeSimone, wild and unpredictable, with a grin that hid a storm. There was Henry Hill, a smart kid with an eye for opportunity, and a mouth that never stopped. And there were others, drivers, thieves, gamblers, all orbiting around Jimmy like planets around the sun. Together, they pulled off jobs that made headlines without ever saying their names. If a truck full of expensive liquor vanished on the highway, or if a warehouse was mysteriously cleaned out overnight, everyone in the underworld knew who was behind it, but nobody dared say it out loud. One night, as Jimmy sat in a booth at Robert's Lounge, his unofficial headquarters, Henry leaned in and said, "Jimmy, we're sitting on gold here. With the right move, we could own the whole airport." Jimmy smiled faintly, his cigarette glowing between his fingers. "Henry," he said softly, "you never own anything in this life. You just rent it, and the rent's due every day." It was a lesson that stuck, because in Jimmy's world, success wasn't permanent. It was borrowed, and sooner or later, the debt always came, due. He was building something bigger than himself, something that would shake the foundations of New York's underworld. But for now, he kept his moves small and his circle tighter than ever. The money was flowing, the jobs were clean, and no one suspected how far his ambition would take him. On the surface, Jimmy Burke was just another wise guy with a good suit and a winning grin. But beneath that charm was a strategist who saw crime not as chaos, but as business. Every heist was a chess move, every dollar a calculated risk. And in the smoky corners of Robert's lounge, with laughter, whiskey, and Sinatra playing in the background, Jimmy Burke was quietly planning the biggest score New York would ever see. The night stretched on. Deals were whispered, promises made. Outside, the streets glistened under a drizzle of rain, reflecting the neon lights of bars and diners. Somewhere far away, a truck engine hummed, a plane took off, and Jimmy's empire, built on trust, silence, and audacity, grew one move closer to legend. No one at that table knew it yet, but the story of Jimmy the Gent Burke was only just beginning. And before it was over, his name would become synonymous with one of the boldest heists in American history. The pieces were moving, the players ready. And in the quiet of that smoky bar, Jimmy's calm voice broke the silence. "Boys, I think it's time we start thinking bigger." The following month saw the quiet rise of Jimmy Burke's empire take a more calculated, deliberate shape. He'd already made his mark on the hijacking game. No one could touch him there. Every week, another truck went missing from the JFK runways or the expressways leading out of the city. It didn't matter what it carried: whiskey, cigarettes, clothes, electronics. Jimmy's crew knew how to move it and how to make it disappear. But Jimmy wasn't satisfied. For him, success wasn't about having more money. It was about control. And that kind of control, in the underworld of New York, didn't come from guns or fear. It came from connections, timing, and loyalty. Robert's lounge became his nerve center, a second home where deals were made and alliances were sealed. The bar's cracked leather booths and flickering jukebox light gave it an almost sacred feel for the crew. Henry Hill, Tommy DeSimone, and a handful of other trusted associates spent long nights there, drinking, laughing, and listening to Jimmy map out the future with the calm precision of a chess master. One night, Henry came in with big news. He'd met a guy at the airport, a guy who handled incoming cash shipments for Lufthansa, one of the biggest airlines in the world. "They're moving millions, Jimmy," Henry said, voice low. "Sometimes 6-7 million at a time, just sitting there in a vault for a few hours before it gets picked up." Jimmy didn't react right away. He took a slow sip of his drink, staring at the smoke curling from his cigarette. The room seemed to still around him. When he finally looked up, his eyes glinted with something sharp, calculating. 6 million, he said softly. "In cash?" Henry nodded. "Unmarked bills. It's clean money, Jimmy. Straight from the airlines to the banks." Jimmy smiled faintly but didn't say more. He just leaned back in the booth, lost in thought. That night he didn't sleep. He stayed up, walking his living room floor in silence, the idea burning through his mind. He'd been part of big scores before, but this was different. This wasn't a truck. This was history. But big scores required patience, and patience was something Jimmy had in abundance. He started by tightening his crew. Only the most loyal men could be part of something like this. He didn't want wild cards or hotheads. He needed professionals. Tommy DeSimone, though unpredictable, was fearless. Henry knew the airport inside out, and Jimmy had his network of longshoremen, drivers, and union contacts who could make problems vanish. Slowly, quietly, he began to put the pieces in place. Meanwhile, Jimmy's reputation grew. To the outside world, he was Jimmy the Gent, a man who tipped big, dressed sharp, and never lost his temper. He gave money to neighborhood kids, helped old-timers keep their bars open, and always looked out for his own. But those who really knew him understood that beneath that charm was a mind that never stopped moving. One evening, at a small restaurant in Queens, Paul Vario joined Jimmy for dinner. Paul was older now, but still sharp. "You're getting too ambitious, Jimmy," he warned, swirling his glass of red wine. "You start thinking you're bigger than the family. The wrong people notice." Jimmy smiled politely. "I'm not bigger than anyone, Paul. I just like to keep things running smooth." Paul gave him a long, knowing look. "Smooth gets slippery," he said quietly. But by then, Jimmy was already in too deep. His network was growing beyond Vario's reach, and even the Lucchese family benefited from his operations. They needed him as much as he needed them. Outside the mob, however, the world was changing. The FBI was getting smarter, technology was advancing, and the old ways of running the streets were dying. Jimmy adapted quickly. He started using coded payphones, kept fewer records, and never carried incriminating cash. To his men, he seemed untouchable. Everything he touched turned to gold. Every move he made felt inevitable, as if the universe itself was bending to his plans. But Jimmy knew better. Luck had nothing to do with it. It was all about control, of people, of timing, of fear. One night after closing time at Robert's Lounge, Jimmy stayed behind with Henry and Tommy. The place was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. He pulled out a small notebook, flipping through names, dates, and numbers. "We've been playing small," he said finally. "It's time to do something that'll set us up for life." Tommy grinned. "You talking about the Lufthansa thing?" Jimmy didn't look up. He just smirked. That same calm, dangerous smirk that told everyone in the room he'd already made up his mind. "We're not talking about anything," he said. "Not yet. But when the time comes, everyone will get their cut. Just remember, no one outside this room hears a word. Ever." Henry felt a chill run through him. He'd seen that look before, the one that meant Jimmy was serious. Dead serious. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. Inside, Jimmy Burke's crew sat in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. They didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of something that would change their lives forever. In the coming months, the plan would evolve, twisting through layers of secrecy and deception. And Jimmy, with his quiet authority and unshakable calm, would become the center of it all, the mastermind behind a heist that would rewrite the rules of the underworld. But for now, as the night dragged on and the rain washed the streets clean, he just leaned back, lit another cigarette, and said softly, "Timing is everything, boys. Timing and silence." The men nodded, not realizing those two words, timing and silence, would soon become the line between fortune and disaster, loyalty and betrayal, life and death. By the fall of 1978, the plan that had once been whispered in the dim light of Robert's Lounge was starting to take shape. Jimmy Burke moved with quiet precision, like a man laying tracks for a train no one else could see. Every detail, every connection, every risk was calculated down to the smallest second. This wasn't just another score. This was going to be the score. The Lufthansa job. It began with whispers from inside the airport. A cargo worker, someone Jimmy's crew had befriended, passed along word that millions in unmarked bills were flown in from Germany every few weeks, sitting in the Lufthansa terminal vault overnight before being picked up by armored trucks. No one thought much of it, but Jimmy did. He spent weeks verifying it. He had Henry Hill talk to the right people, feel out the schedules, confirm the security setup. He learned how many guards were on duty, how often they rotated, what time the armored truck arrived. He even learned the make and model of the lock on the vault door. Nothing was left to chance. But Jimmy knew better than to rush. He'd seen plenty of crews go down not because the job was bad, but because the timing was off, or someone got greedy, or someone couldn't keep quiet. So, he waited, pulling strings in silence, never revealing more than what each man needed to know. In early December, the plan was ready. The crew would move in before dawn, dressed like airport workers, with the right uniforms and ID tags. They'd use an insider to get through the gate, take control fast, grab the cash, and be out before sunrise. No drama, no noise, no witnesses. Jimmy's rule was simple. You get in, you get out, you disappear. In the weeks leading up to it, tension hung over Robert's Lounge like smoke. Henry Hill paced, restless with anticipation. Tommy DeSimone bragged to anyone who'd listen, though Jimmy kept warning him to shut up. "You start running your mouth, Tommy," he told him, eyes cold, "and you won't see a dime." Tommy grinned, but deep down, he knew Jimmy wasn't joking. No one ever mistook Jimmy's calm for kindness. The night before the job, the crew met one last time. The bar was closed, lights low, Sinatra playing on the jukebox. Jimmy stood at the end of the room, leaning against the counter, eyes sweeping across the faces of the men who'd make history in a few hours. "Listen to me," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the music. "You pull this right, we're all set for life. You slip up, and we're all finished. No names, no bragging, no big spending. We keep quiet. We keep alive. Got it?" The men nodded. Even Tommy, usually all swagger and smirk, kept his head down. Jimmy didn't go on the heist himself. He never did. That was part of his genius. He was the architect, not the builder. He stayed in the background, pulling the strings while his men took the risks. At 3 a.m. on December 11, 1978, the Lufthansa terminal at JFK fell silent. A van pulled up to a side gate. The guards on duty saw what they thought were airport workers arriving early. Within minutes, the terminal was under control. No alarms, no gunfire, no chaos. Just a perfectly executed operation. When the crew broke into the vault, their flashlights hit the stacks of cash, millions in unmarked bills. And for a moment, time froze. $6 million. In 1978, it was the largest cash heist in American history. By dawn, it was over. The guards were tied up, unharmed, the van gone, and the vault empty. The FBI wouldn't even know what hit them until hours later, when the first shift showed up for work. Jimmy heard the news on the radio that morning as he sat in his kitchen, sipping coffee, pretending to read the paper. His wife looked up at him and said, "Didn't you work near that place?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, turning the page. "Crazy, huh?" But inside he was calm, not excited, not proud, just steady. He'd pulled off the impossible, and now came the most important part, keeping it clean. Over the next few days, the crew started showing up at Robert's Lounge, one by one. They were ecstatic, laughing, bragging, making plans for their cuts. Tommy was the loudest of them all, already talking about new suits, cars, and big nights out. Jimmy sat in the corner, quiet as ever, watching. When Tommy started going on about how he was going to buy his girl a fur coat the size of a car, Jimmy leaned forward and said softly, "Tommy, you buy that coat, you'll be wearing it to your funeral." Tommy laughed it off, but Jimmy didn't. He knew the hardest part of any big job wasn't the job itself. It was what came after. The money made men sloppy. It made them loud. And in the world Jimmy lived in, loud men didn't live long. Within a week, the city was buzzing. The heist was on every front page, every TV channel. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation, and Jimmy's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Everyone wanted a piece. Everyone wanted information. But Jimmy said nothing. He kept his routine, played it cool, and waited for the noise to fade. Behind the calm, though, he was already watching his crew carefully. He could see it, the greed, the arrogance, the recklessness creeping in. Men were buying new cars, jewelry, spending cash like it would never run out. And Jimmy knew what that meant. The Lufthansa heist had made them rich, but it had also made them targets. In the quiet corners of his mind, Jimmy started forming another plan, a plan to clean up his crew before the heat got too close. Because if there was one thing Jimmy Burke had learned in a lifetime of crime, it was that success doesn't destroy you. People do. The aftermath of the Lufthansa heist changed everything. On the streets, it was whispered like a miracle. A crew of nobodies had pulled off the biggest cash robbery in American history and vanished into the night. Newspapers called it the perfect crime. But for Jimmy Burke, perfection didn't exist. He knew that when something burned that bright, it always left ashes behind. For a few weeks, he kept things calm. He made no sudden moves, no flashy purchases, and told everyone to lay low. "We wait," he said. "Let the city talk. Let the heat cool down. Then we'll divide." But not everyone listened. Henry Hill noticed it first. The cars, the suits, the arrogance. Men who were supposed to be invisible were suddenly acting like celebrities. Parnell Stacks Edwards bought a new van, flaunting it like a trophy. Tommy DeSimone couldn't keep quiet. He bragged in bars, in restaurants, anywhere someone would listen. Even people outside the crew started asking questions. Jimmy saw it all, but he didn't say much. He just watched, silent and calculating, that calm smile never leaving his face. The calmer he looked, the more nervous everyone else became, because when Jimmy stopped talking, trouble usually followed. Then came the mistake that started it all. Stacks was supposed to get rid of the getaway van, the single piece of evidence that could tie them to the heist. He was supposed to drive it to New Jersey, crush it, and walk away. But instead, he parked it on a busy street in Brooklyn, got high, and forgot about it. A few days later, the FBI found it. Fingerprints, evidence, everything. The headline screamed about a breakthrough. Jimmy read the papers quietly over breakfast, not saying a word. But inside, he was already rewriting the ending. That night, at Robert's lounge, the atmosphere was tense. The jukebox was silent, the laughter gone. Jimmy sat at his usual booth, a cigarette burning slow between his fingers. Henry sat across from him, uneasy. "Stacks messed up, huh?" Henry said softly. Jimmy looked up, eyes cold as glass. "He didn't mess up," he said. "He ended the party." The next few weeks were a storm that only Jimmy could control. People started disappearing, quietly, efficiently, without warning. No scenes, no traces. The money was never distributed, not fully. Most of it remained hidden, and only Jimmy knew where. He wasn't doing it out of anger. To him, it was business. Loose ends brought heat. Heat brought prison. Prison ended everything. And Jimmy Burke wasn't going to let anyone end what he'd built. Henry started losing sleep. Every time the phone rang, he jumped. Every time Jimmy called him over, he wondered if it was the last time he'd see daylight. "You think Jimmy's losing it?" Tommy once asked him, grinning like it was a joke. Henry just stared at him. "Tommy, I don't think Jimmy ever had it to lose." The FBI turned up the pressure, watching every bar, every phone line, every known associate. Agents swarmed JFK, interrogating workers, digging for names. But Jimmy kept his distance. On paper, he was clean. He never touched the cash, never handled the van, never said a word. His genius was in staying invisible. Still, the tension started eating away at the crew. People who used to joke and trust each other now looked over their shoulders, wondering who'd be next. The camaraderie that once bound them together turned to fear. Jimmy seemed untouched by it all. He still went to Robert's lounge, still tipped the bartender, still laughed at the old jokes. But there was a new weight behind his calm, a sense that he'd crossed a line and couldn't go back. One evening, Henry walked into the lounge and saw Jimmy sitting alone, staring into his drink. "You ever think about getting out?" Henry asked, half joking, half hopeful. Jimmy looked up slowly. "Out?" he said, like the word didn't make sense. "There's no out, kid. You get out when you stop breathing." Henry didn't press. He just nodded, understanding that Jimmy wasn't a man built for peace. He was built for control. Meanwhile, Tommy was spiraling. He'd been promised to be made, officially inducted into the mafia, something no Irishman like Jimmy could ever achieve. It was all Tommy talked about. But in their world, promises meant nothing without results. Tommy's temper, his impulsiveness, his chaos, they'd drawn too much attention. One day, Tommy disappeared, just like that. Henry heard later that he'd gone to a ceremony, but the ceremony never happened. Jimmy didn't say much, just shook his head. "They clipped him," he muttered. "He was too loud." For Henry, that was the moment the illusion shattered. He'd always seen Jimmy as a kind of father figure, a man who could handle anything, who always had the answers. But now, he saw something else. Jimmy wasn't untouchable. He was just a man trying to hold his world together with silence and fear. The Lufthansa money started to vanish, piece by piece, pocket by pocket. Most of it was never found. The FBI never proved who pulled the job, but everyone in the underworld knew it was Jimmy Burke's operation, his masterpiece. By the early 80s, though, his empire began to crumble. Henry got caught on drug charges. The FBI moved in closer, circling like vultures. One night, as the lights of Queens flickered outside the bar, Jimmy sat in his corner booth, alone, staring at the reflection of his own face in the whiskey glass. He'd built an empire from nothing, outsmarted men twice his rank, pulled off a heist that would live forever in legend. But legends come with a cost, and for Jimmy Burke, that cost was everyone he'd ever trusted. The city outside went on, loud and restless as ever, but inside Robert's lounge, there was only silence. The laughter was gone, the crew scattered, and the man who had once been the calm at the center of every storm was finally left to face the quiet that follows when every secret's been spent. He didn't say it out loud, but deep down, Jimmy knew. The Lufthansa job had made him immortal in name, but doomed him in life. By 1980, the walls were closing in on Jimmy Burke. The Lufthansa heist had made him a legend, but legends attract attention, and attention was the one thing he'd spent his whole life avoiding. The newspapers still whispered about the great airport robbery, but for the FBI, it wasn't a story. It was an obsession. Every agent in New York wanted to be the one who cracked the case. Jimmy's calm never faltered, but inside, he felt the shift. Friends stopped calling. Associates crossed the street when they saw him coming. The old laughter at Robert's lounge was gone, replaced by the heavy silence of fear. Even Henry Hill, once his right hand, was growing jittery, paranoid, reckless, and too deep into drugs to keep his mouth shut. One night, Henry stumbled into the lounge, eyes red, talking too fast. "Jimmy, they're watching me. I swear to God, they're outside my house. My phone's tapped." Jimmy didn't look up from his drink. "You've been using again?" Henry hesitated. "Just a little. Keeps me steady." Jimmy set down his glass slowly. "You think steady means running your mouth about what we did?" His voice was calm, but the words hit like ice. Henry swallowed hard. No, I never said nothing." Jimmy smiled faintly. "Good, because talking gets you killed. You know that." Henry nodded quickly, but the seed of fear was already there. He could feel it. Jimmy's patience was running thin. And once Jimmy started watching you, there was no coming back. Outside, the city kept moving, planes taking off, deals being made, cops running raids. But Jimmy's world was shrinking. Every time he left his house, he scanned the street. Every time the phone rang, he paused before answering. He'd built his life on control, on always being one step ahead. But now the world felt unpredictable, like the ground itself was shifting beneath him. The FBI was tightening its net. They raided bars, questioned airport workers, tracked down anyone even loosely tied to the heist. Evidence was scarce, but fear was everywhere. People who'd once sworn silence started whispering, and in the underworld, whispers could kill faster than bullets. Jimmy responded the only way he knew how, with caution. He pulled back from operations, cut ties, and moved his remaining money into safe hands. But no matter how careful he was, he couldn't stop what was coming. Henry was spiraling fast. He was using too much, talking too much, and his paranoia made him dangerous. He'd started carrying a gun everywhere, jumping at shadows. Jimmy saw it and made a decision. He invited Henry to lunch. They sat at a quiet diner in Queens, the hum of traffic outside and the faint clatter of dishes filling the silence. Jimmy ordered his usual black coffee. Henry fidgeted, barely touching his food. "You look tired," Jimmy said. Henry forced a smile. "Yeah, just been working too hard." Jimmy leaned back, watching him closely. "You gotta take care of yourself, kid. Get some rest. Maybe take a ride with me this weekend out to the country. Fresh air'll do you good." Henry's heart skipped. He knew that line. He'd heard stories, guys invited out to the country who never came back. He nodded, trying to act calm, but his mind was racing. Jimmy smiled again, that same soft, unreadable smile that had fooled so many men before. "You know I love you, kid," he said quietly. "You've been good to me." When Henry left the diner, he didn't go home. He went straight to his car, hands shaking, and sat there for 10 minutes, breathing hard. By the time he started the engine, he'd made his decision. A week later, the FBI knocked on his door. Henry Hill flipped. When Jimmy heard the news, he didn't react. He just sat in silence, staring out the window of his modest house in South Ozone Park. His wife asked if something was wrong. He said nothing, just stood up, put on his coat, and left. At Robert's lounge that night, the regulars watched him walk in. He didn't say a word, just poured himself a drink, stared into it, and sighed. Everyone knew what it meant. Henry Hill had been his protege, his investment, the kid he'd taught everything to. And now, that same kid was about to tear down everything he'd built. The trials began soon after. One by one, Jimmy's associates were picked up, questioned, flipped, and sent away. Henry's testimony tied together years of crimes, hijackings, shakedowns, the Lufthansa job. Jimmy was indicted on multiple charges, but the one that stuck first was for fixing college basketball games in the early 70s. It wasn't the crime they wanted, but it was enough to lock him away while they built the rest of the case. He took it quietly, without protest. No shouting, no panic. Just that same stoic calm he'd carried all his life. "You can't beat time," he said to his lawyer. "You can only waste less of it." Prison was different from the streets, but Jimmy adapted fast. He ran gambling operations from inside, made friends with guards, and turned even confinement into control. But the walls were still walls, and for a man who had spent his life outsmarting everyone, the silence was a cruel companion. Years passed. The world outside moved on. New faces took over the streets. New rules replaced the old codes. The mob wasn't what it used to be. Flashier, riskier, louder. The kind of men Jimmy would have never trusted. In his cell, he kept a small collection of newspaper clippings, stories about the Lufthansa Heist, about Henry's testimony, about the changing face of organized crime. He'd read them at night quietly, and sometimes laughed to himself. The papers called it unsolved. They had theories, names, guesses, but never the truth. Jimmy had made sure of that. One evening, as the sun dipped below the prison walls, Jimmy sat by his window, the light turning everything gold. Another inmate asked him once if he regretted it. The heist, the money, the silence. Jimmy just smiled. "Regrets for people who think they could have done it different," he said. "I did it the only way I knew how." And in that simple truth was everything about him. The loyalty, the calculation, the quiet defiance. He'd built his empire from the ground up, played by his own rules, and even when the world turned against him, he never broke. The legend of Jimmy the Gent Burke wasn't written in blood or fear. It was written in silence. And even behind bars, that silence was louder than anything the world could say about him. By the mid-1980s, Jimmy Burke had spent a few years behind bars, but even prison walls couldn't completely cage the man's mind. He was still the Gent, calm, calculating, and oddly respected by both inmates and guards. He carried himself with quiet dignity, like a man who had accepted his fate but refused to surrender to it. Inside, Jimmy had found a rhythm. He kept himself busy running small operations, a little gambling here, some influence with the kitchen staff there. He never acted like he was trapped. Instead, he made prison work for him. He'd fix card games, organize bets on sports, and lend money to other inmates. The guards looked the other way, not because they were paid off, but because Jimmy had a way of making everyone feel like they owed him something. But outside those walls, the world was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. The old rules of the mob were dying. The new generation of gangsters didn't live by loyalty or silence. They flaunted money, invited cameras, and craved fame. The kind of men Jimmy had always despised. Meanwhile, Henry Hill's decision to flip had rippled through everything. Jimmy knew Henry's cooperation had helped the feds dismantle entire circles of the old crew. It didn't matter that Jimmy's name still carried a certain respect. To the FBI, he was unfinished business. To the mob, he was a risk they preferred to forget. In 1985, Jimmy's son, Frankie Burke, got into trouble of his own. Frankie had always wanted to be like his father, sharp, fearless, always in control. But the streets had changed, and the new generation didn't respect the old codes. One night, after a fight with the wrong crowd, Frankie disappeared. When Jimmy got the news in prison, his hands trembled for the first time in years. The prison doctor later said he sat silently for hours, just staring at the wall, whispering his son's name under his breath. That loss broke something inside him. Frankie was his pride, the one person he wanted to guide, to protect, to maybe one day see live clean. And now, that chance was gone. After that, Jimmy became quieter. His once sharp wit turned softer, more reflective. He spent more time in the prison yard, walking in circles, his mind replaying old memories like a film reel he couldn't shut off. The sound of dice rolling, the laughter at Robert's lounge, the clink of glasses. Those sounds had defined his world once. Now, all he heard was the echo of the past. One afternoon, a young inmate approached him. The kid was barely 20, nervous but ambitious. "Hey, you're Jimmy Burke, right?" Jimmy glanced at him, amused. "That's what they say." "I heard you pulled off the Lufthansa thing," the kid whispered, glancing around. "That was legendary, man. How'd you do it?" Jimmy smirked faintly. "Kid, legends are just stories people tell when they forget the truth." The boy frowned. "So, you're saying it didn't happen?" Jimmy shrugged. "I'm saying what you don't say matters more than what you do." The kid didn't understand, but Jimmy didn't expect him to. The new generation wanted glory, not survival. They wanted to be famous. Jimmy just wanted to be forgotten. Every once in a while, an old friend would write him a letter, a few careful lines about the neighborhood, mutual acquaintances, or rumors. Most of the old crew were gone or hiding. Tommy DeSimone, his wild enforcer, had vanished years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Paul Vario, the old boss, had died in prison. It seemed like the world Jimmy had built was dissolving piece by piece. In 1987, Jimmy was transferred to Wenda Correctional Facility, a tougher place, but even there, he managed to carve out a small corner of control. He'd sit in the common area reading newspapers, listening to the faint hum of TV news talking about new drug wars, Wall Street scandals, and the fall of old crime families. Sometimes he'd laugh to himself. The world outside was becoming everything he'd predicted: greed without loyalty, chaos without structure. He'd once said to Henry, "You can't trust anyone who smiles too much." Looking back, he realized he'd been talking about an entire generation. Late at night, when the prison quieted down, Jimmy would lie on his bunk staring at the ceiling. The silence reminded him of winter nights in Ozone Park, snow outside, his wife cooking in the kitchen, the faint sound of Sinatra on the radio. Those were the moments that softened him, that reminded him that beneath all the cold calculation, he was still a man who'd loved deeply, his family, his friends, even the code he lived by. One winter morning, Jimmy received a rare visit. It was his daughter, Kathy. She looked older, her face lined with years of worry. She sat across from him in the visitation room, her eyes watery but steady. "Dad," she said quietly, "you've been in here too long." Jimmy smiled faintly. "That's the way it goes, sweetheart. You play the game, you take the fall." She shook her head. "I just wish you'd walked away when you could." He looked at her for a long moment. "You can't walk away from what you are," he said, "but you can choose how to end it." Kathy reached across the table and took his hand. "Then promise me you'll end it right." For the first time in a long time, Jimmy didn't have an answer. He just nodded, holding her hand tight, the silence between them saying what words never could. After she left, he sat alone, watching her walk out of the visitation area. That small glimpse of his daughter, alive, free, strong, gave him a strange kind of peace. Maybe, he thought, this was what the end was supposed to feel like. Not defeat, not regret, just stillness. In the yard that evening, a cold wind blew through the prison fences. Jimmy stood there, hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky. Somewhere above the clouds, planes were flying, maybe out of JFK, maybe Lufthansa itself, and the sound of their engines echoed faintly across the air. He smiled to himself. He'd stolen from the skies once. Now all he wanted was to fade into them. But fate wasn't done with Jimmy Burke yet, because even as he grew older, weaker, and more forgotten, the legend of the Gent was still alive out there, whispered in bars, studied by detectives, admired by criminals who never even knew his face. And that legend, for better or worse, was about to outlive the man himself. The story of Jimmy Burke was no longer his to control. It had taken a life of its own. By the early 1990s, Jimmy Burke had become something of a ghost. Alive, yes, but fading into the background of a world that had moved on. The streets that once whispered his name now belonged to new kinds of criminals. Flashier, younger, more reckless. The mob had splintered into fragments, and loyalty was no longer a code. It was a punchline. Inside Wenda Correctional Facility, Jimmy had settled into a quiet existence. He kept to a small circle of older inmates, men who, like him, came from a world that believed in silence, respect, and keeping business off the streets. They'd play cards, share cigarettes, and talk about old times. It was strange. They weren't so much remembering glory as they were holding on to what little of themselves they still had left. But Jimmy's health was beginning to turn. The years of tension, of holding everything inside, had started to show. He'd developed a bad cough that wouldn't go away and a sharp pain in his chest that kept him up at night. The prison doctor told him it was just age and stress, but Jimmy knew better. He'd seen too much to mistake slow decline for anything else. Still, he never complained. Each morning he'd rise early, shave, and walk the yard before most men were awake. The guards used to joke that Burke treated prison like it was his own private business. One of them once said, "He walks around here like he's still collecting envelopes." And in a way, he was. Even behind bars, Jimmy kept his quiet empire running. He helped other inmates manage debts, settled disputes, even advised a few younger ones who were eager but foolish. His reputation carried weight. Nobody wanted to cross him, not because he was violent anymore, but because he didn't need to be. His silence carried power. One day, a new inmate arrived, a loudmouth from the city who claimed to have connections. He bragged about money, women, and deals gone right. The young guy thought he could impress Jimmy by name-dropping the old Lufthansa Heist. "They say that job was an inside thing," the kid said one day at lunch, smirking. "Some genius pulled it off and vanished with the money. You know anything about that, old man?" Jimmy didn't even look up from his tray. "If someone did," he said calmly, "they were smart enough not to talk about it in a cafeteria." The table went quiet. The kid shut his mouth. And that was the end of that. In private, though, Jimmy found the moment almost funny. The heist, the one thing that had defined his legend, was now just gossip for kids who hadn't even been alive when it happened. The truth of it, the precision, the danger, the silence, all of it had been replaced by rumor and exaggeration. And that was exactly how Jimmy wanted it. The money from Lufthansa was never found. Not a dollar. Not a trace. Some believed Jimmy had buried it somewhere, hidden it so deep even the ground forgot. Others said it was long gone, spent, lost, stolen. Jimmy never confirmed or denied any of it. If anyone asked, he'd just smile faintly and say, "Money's only good when it's quiet." But even as his legend grew, Jimmy himself was shrinking. He'd begun coughing blood, losing weight, and struggling to breathe. The prison staff transferred him to the medical wing where the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and loneliness. He refused most of the treatment, telling the nurses he'd lived long enough. One night, as he lay awake, a guard named Collins, a decent man who'd known Jimmy for years, stopped by his bedside. "You ever think about it, Burke?" Collins asked. "All the things you could have done different?" Jimmy smiled weakly. "You ever hear of a man changing the ending to his own story?" Collins shook his head. "Guess not." "Then there's your answer," Jimmy said softly. "You live the life you choose, and the bill always comes due. I just made sure mine was paid in cash." The guard chuckled. "You know, for what it's worth, most of the guys here respect you, even the ones who don't know why." Jimmy turned his head slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Respect's not about knowing, it's about remembering not to forget." As the weeks went by, Jimmy's world grew smaller, a bed, a window, a few hours of daylight. But inside his head, he was everywhere. He'd drift through the memories like smoke, the laughter of Robert's lounge, the smell of bourbon, the feel of winter air biting at his face after a big score. He remembered Henry Hill too, not with anger, but with something closer to disappointment. He'd once told Henry, "You can't build a house on shortcuts." Now lying there, he realized Henry had tried, and the wind had blown it all away. One afternoon, Kathy came to visit again. She brought old photo, black and white shots of the family, the neighborhood, a much younger Jimmy holding her as a baby. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The streets?" he said, his voice rough. "No, you can't miss what was never yours to keep." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "You know they still talk about you out there. They call you a legend." Jimmy smiled faintly. "Legends are for people who don't know the truth." After she left, he sat with those words, staring out the window as snow began to fall. Thick, quiet flakes settling against the bars. There was something peaceful about it. The silence between each flake falling like the world itself was exhaling. That night he had a dream. He was back in Queens, standing outside Robert's lounge. The neon sign flickered softly. Inside, laughter and Sinatra's voice floated through the smoke. Tommy DeSimone was at the bar, pouring drinks. Henry was telling stories. Paul Vario sat in the corner, nodding slowly to the music. Everyone was alive, untouched, unbroken. Jimmy smiled, stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. When the morning came, the nurse found him still in bed, peaceful, a faint half-smile on his face. Jimmy, the Gent, Burke, had gone quietly, the same way he'd lived, without spectacle, without fear, without confession. Outside, the world kept moving. Planes still flew out of JFK, the city still buzzed with 1,000 stories, and somewhere, in a dim corner of Queens, someone would still whisper his name. But for those who truly knew him, Jimmy wasn't just a gangster or a thief. He was the last of a kind, a man who believed in codes even when everyone else had forgotten them. And in the end, his greatest act of loyalty was the silence he never broke. Years passed, but Jimmy Burke's legend refused to fade. Even long after his death, his name carried an air of mystery, the kind that made storytellers lean in and detectives lose sleep. The Lufthansa Heist remained the crown jewel of unsolved crimes in American history. And though everyone thought they knew who'd done it, nobody could ever prove it. That was the Burke way. Do it clean, do it quiet, and never leave a trace. In the neighborhoods where he once ruled, old men would sit outside barbershops and talk about him like a ghost who still haunted the city. "Jimmy the Gent," they'd say, "always looked like he'd buy you a drink, but you never really knew what he was thinking." To the younger crowd, he was just a name in a movie, the real-life inspiration behind stories that Hollywood had glamorized, twisted, and sold to the world. But to those who'd lived it, Jimmy wasn't just a gangster. He was discipline in human form, the cold, unflinching face of control. Henry Hill, the man who'd once been his protege, had turned his own life into a spectacle. After entering witness protection, he spent years giving interviews, writing books, and living off the shadow of his past. On television, Henry painted Jimmy as both mentor and menace, a man capable of generosity and terrifying precision. But every time Henry told the story, there was something missing. The heart of it, the silence that defined Jimmy. Henry's words made Jimmy famous, but they also made him misunderstood. The world saw the Gent as a symbol of ruthless ambition, but the truth was more complicated. Jimmy Burke didn't crave fame or fear. What he valued was order. In a world of chaos, he built systems. In a business of betrayal, he built trust, or at least the illusion of it. Years after his death, an FBI agent named Collins, the same one who'd guarded him in his final years, retired from the bureau. In his old age, he began writing a memoir about the men he'd met behind bars. When he came to Jimmy's chapter, he paused. How do you describe a man who said so little, yet meant so much to everyone around him? Collins wrote, Jimmy Burke wasn't loud, but you felt him in every room. He didn't threaten, didn't shout, didn't play tough. He'd look at you, and you'd tell him everything. He wasn't a monster. He was something scarier, a man who understood people better than they understood themselves. The memoir was never published, but a few pages leaked years later, sparking renewed fascination with Jimmy's story. Documentaries were made. Journalists retraced the Lufthansa case, chasing rumors about buried cash, hidden safety deposit boxes, or secret accounts in Europe. None of it ever led anywhere. It was as if Jimmy had vanished along with the money, absorbed by the myth he created. Meanwhile, Kathy Burke, his daughter, had grown into a quiet, private woman. She rarely spoke about her father, though she carried pieces of him everywhere. The composure, the discipline, the eyes that seemed to see everything without needing to look twice. When reporters tried to find her, she politely declined every interview. My father made his choices, she once said, and he paid for them. That's all there is to say. But once a year, on the anniversary of his death, she would visit his grave at Calvary Cemetery. She never brought flowers, just stood there in silence for a while, whispering a few words that no one else could hear, and then she'd leave. It was said that the first time she visited, a small envelope was waiting at the headstone. Inside was a single playing card, the King of Hearts, and a note written in shaky cursive, for the man who never folded. No one ever found out who left it. In the years that followed, the world changed faster than ever. The mob of Jimmy's day, the sharp suits, the quiet respect, the rules, was gone. The new generation didn't care for codes or discipline. They flaunted their power on social media, posted pictures with cash, bragged about crimes that hadn't even been committed yet. To old-timers, it was all noise. One man, an aging associate who'd once run errands for Burke, summed it up perfectly in an interview. Jimmy was from a time when silence was the currency. These kids today, they spend everything they got just to be seen. And maybe that's why Jimmy's story endures, not just because of the heist or the headlines, but because he represented something the world lost, a belief in control, in strategy, in the art of keeping your mouth shut when everyone else wanted to talk. Years later, a historian studying organized crime found something strange buried in an old FBI file. It was a note scribbled in the margin of a declassified report, dated 1979, a month after the Lufthansa heist. It read, "Burke too smart for this, he'll move quiet, and will never find a dime." The historian smiled when he read it, because it turned out that even the FBI, the same agency that had chased Jimmy his entire life, had come to respect his craft. Jimmy Burke had beaten the system not by running faster, but by staying still. He understood people, patterns, and pressure better than anyone. He knew that every man eventually broke, except the one who said nothing. The silence of Jimmy the Gent Burke still lingers, in the pages of crime history, in the whispers of old barrooms, and in the unspoken code that true professionals once lived by. Because in the end, he didn't need to tell his story. The world told it for him. And every time someone mentions the Lufthansa heist, every time someone wonders where the money went, or how no one ever got caught, the same invisible shadow passes through the conversation. A calm voice, somewhere in the back of the mind, saying what Jimmy always believed. The smartest man in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it. As the 2000s came around, the name Jimmy the Gent Burke began to resurface once more. This time not in courtrooms or crime reports, but in documentaries, books, and whispered conversations between people who admired the old-school code of silence that had long since vanished from the underworld. For decades, the Lufthansa heist had stood as one of the most audacious crimes in American history. Over $5 million stolen in one night, and not a single person ever officially charged for it. Every few years, the FBI reopened the case hoping for a new lead, a new name, or even a single trace of the missing money. But each time they came up empty-handed. The men who might have talked were long dead, and those who'd lived through it had learned from the best. Jimmy Burke. The media loved the mystery. Where's the money? Became the great unsolved riddle of New York's underworld. Some claimed Jimmy buried it in a safe house in Queens. Others said it had been smuggled out of the country and laundered through offshore accounts. One rumor even suggested that Jimmy had hidden it in plain sight, investing it into small businesses that thrived quietly for years, unnoticed. But the truth was, no one really knew. That was the beauty of it. Jimmy had built his reputation not on the chaos of crime, but on the precision of it. His mind worked like a chessboard, always 3 moves ahead. Even when he lost, even when he ended up behind bars, he was still controlling the board. The older mobsters who remembered him often said the same thing. Jimmy wasn't the kind of man who bragged. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. If you were smart, you'd listen when he spoke. And if you were smarter, you'd listen to what he didn't say. In the years after his death, his legacy took on a strange duality. To law enforcement, he was a criminal mastermind who had humiliated them. To the streets, he was the last of the true gentleman thieves, ruthless but refined, strategic but fair. To his family, though, he was a complicated ghost. A father who had loved deeply but lived dangerously. A man whose choices had given them comfort and pain in equal measure. Kathy, his daughter, had tried to move on. She rarely spoke about her father publicly, but sometimes when journalists approached her with genuine respect, she'd share fragments. He wasn't what people think, she once said softly in an interview for a documentary that never aired. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent for no reason. He believed there was a right and wrong way to do things, even in his world. He had rules. He always said, if you're going to take something, do it clean and make sure everyone eats. Her voice trembled when she added, he wasn't proud of everything he did, but he never ran from it either. He used to tell me, the only thing worse than a liar is a coward. That same year, the FBI publicly announced the closing of the Lufthansa investigation. After decades of searching, they declared it officially unresolved. The case files were archived and the mystery was left to history. In truth, the agents knew what everyone else did. Even if Jimmy had hidden something, it was long gone, lost to time and silence. But Jimmy's influence didn't vanish with him. Younger criminals, fascinated by the old ways, started studying his methods like a blueprint. They admired how he'd operated without flash, without chaos, without letting his ego ruin his control. One former enforcer from a later crew summed it up perfectly. Jimmy was proof you could be feared without being loud. That's power most people don't understand anymore. In 2004, a new documentary titled The Last Gentleman of the Mob premiered quietly on late-night cable. It painted a picture of Jimmy not as a monster, but as a paradox. A man who could commit crimes with clinical precision and yet show loyalty that seemed almost sacred. The final line of the film said it best. Jimmy Burke didn't just pull off the perfect heist, he pulled off the perfect exit, vanishing into silence while the world kept talking. That single sentence reignited the legend. Online forums buzzed with theories. Some people claimed they'd found hints of his fortune in old properties. Others swore they'd met men who once worked for him, still living quietly off Lufthansa money. Of course, none of it was ever proven. And if Jimmy had been alive, he would have smiled at all the noise, because every rumor was just another smokescreen protecting the truth. In Queens, Robert's Lounge, the old meeting spot where so much had begun, had long been shut down. The building changed owners, became a bakery, then a storage unit, then an empty shell. But neighbors said that on certain quiet nights when the wind passed through the alley, you could still almost hear it. The faint echo of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and Sinatra's voice playing from a jukebox that hadn't worked in 40 years. One winter evening, a journalist researching for a book stood in that same alley recording notes. He'd spent months chasing Jimmy's story, talking to everyone from retired cops to old bar owners. Finally, he looked at the building and muttered to himself, "Where did you hide it, Burke?" The wind blew, cold and silent, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, he thought he heard a whisper. Not loud, not clear, but unmistakably amused. "Wouldn't you like to know?" He smiled. Whether it was his imagination or not didn't matter. That was the thing about Jimmy Burke. Even in death, he had the last word. The journalist closed his notebook and walked away, realizing something every detective before him had learned too late. Some secrets don't want to be found, and some men are buried not in dirt, but in silence. Jimmy the Gent Burke wasn't just part of history. He was the shadow it left behind. Years later, Jimmy Burke's story became less about crime and more about myth, a tale that blurred the line between fact and folklore. The streets that once trembled at his name now told stories about him like bedtime legends. In small bars across Queens and Brooklyn, old men who'd once run numbers or loaded trucks would raise a glass and say, "You know, Jimmy did it right. He took care of his own." They spoke with a kind of reverence that was rare in the underworld, because for all the blood and money that had run through those years, Jimmy had maintained something that others lost: a code. He didn't steal from his friends, didn't betray his word, and never let greed outpace loyalty. His son Frankie, who'd tried for years to outrun the shadow of his father's name, couldn't escape it. After his own stints in and out of prison, he'd finally decided to live quietly. He ran a small business upstate. Nothing glamorous, just enough to stay off the radar. People who met him later in life said he still carried that same calm confidence Jimmy had, the same quiet intensity that made others lower their voices when he entered a room. Frankie never confirmed or denied the rumors about the missing Lufthansa money. Sometimes, when someone asked him directly, he'd smirk, that same half-smile his father was known for, and say, if my old man hid something, he'd make sure nobody ever found it. And then he'd change the subject. The truth was, the legend of Jimmy Burke had become bigger than the man himself. Hollywood turned his story into gold. Books, documentaries, and films romanticized his life, painting him as both villain and hero, the man who could plan the perfect heist yet still walk into church on Sunday with his kids. The movie Goodfellas made him famous under a different name, but those who knew him recognized every glance, every gesture. They said the actor captured the essence, the danger behind the calm. But behind all the glamour, there was a quieter legacy, one left to those who truly knew him. Jimmy had always believed that loyalty was the only real currency. Money came and went. Power faded. But loyalty could make a man immortal. Kathy, now much older, once said in a rare interview, "My father wasn't just feared. He was respected. That's the difference. He had a way of making people want to follow him, not because they were scared, but because they trusted he'd never lie to them. That's what people don't understand. He wasn't a monster. He was a man born in a time that demanded monsters." As the years passed, the world changed. The mafia Jimmy had once served disintegrated into smaller, greedier factions. The rules were gone. The honor, the codes, all vanished. The new generation wanted fame, not discipline. They craved noise, not control. And that, in a way,